Hey peeps, Robert Costa here, aka Groove Mechanic, Ableton certified trainer and developer of GMaudio Max for Live devices. In this video, I want to go through some of the changes in Clipper version 2.4. Now, in the last 3 versions, the oversampling has changed each time, and version 2.4 is no different. In version 2.2, it was 5 times oversampling, but it was using this delta oversampling technique, which essentially oversampled the difference and then added that to the original signal. And what that did was effectively make the oversampling filter completely disappear. Now, that was all well and good, but I did have a few customers hit me up and say that they didn't like the remainder being left in the signal. So basically, the unprocessed sound that was outside of the oversampling filter's passband would still be present in the final output, and it was noticeable if you turned up the input gain. So quite a few people turn up the input rather than changing the ceiling, and then that kind of exacerbated that remainder, and then when you turned on the limiter, it sounded a little bit funny. So what I've done in Clipper version 2.4 is that I've gone back to 5 times oversampling. It is a slightly longer filter, so slightly more latency, still only 14 samples without the limiter and 16 samples with it. The anti-aliasing has been improved again, and I've also changed the cutoff of the oversampling filter to take advantage of some optimizations, so it's a little bit more CPU efficient. And I've removed the delta oversampling technique, but with a little bit of extra math, I've been able to kind of add that feature back in, and it is now in the options panel here under FIR remainder. So what this does is essentially makes it react more like previous versions of Clipper, but this time around you have a control for the amount of that remainder. So you can turn it all the way up and it'll be like the previous versions of Clipper, or you can just have a little bit in there so it kind of makes a little bit of the oversampling filtering disappear. And sometimes that can be quite good on mastering with light clipping, or you can just leave it at minus infinity and it'll act like most clippers on the market do. I've also added an extra low pass filter after clipping and after the FIR remainder, but I'll go into how those sound with some examples later. First, I just wanted to show the improvements in the anti-aliasing in the past 3 versions. So if we go to Clipper version 2.2, now I've got a similar setup to what I had in the previous video. I've just changed the frequency slightly so it's a little bit easier to see the aliasing. So I've got frequency set to 224, the multiplication set to 10. This is a sine wave, just with a little bit of attack, just to stop the pops at the very start of the waveform. I've got that playing over quite a few bars, just so it plays one long note, and the output volume set to minus 4.5. And now with this off, reaches almost 0 dB. So it's slightly off, but close enough. Now with this on, and then soloing each of these different versions. Now I've got some macros set up in this audio effect track to control the parameters of all these different plugins or devices. And the first one being version 2.2. So this is with a knee of 6 dB and a ceiling of roughly minus 12. And we can see that there is a little bit of aliasing creeping up. It's still well below the 16-bit level, which would be roughly 96 dB. And yeah, so most of it's below 108 dB, which is good. When we go to version 2.3, which is a previous version, we can see that some of that aliasing kind of changes. It is slightly better in some cases, but if you go really hard with the clipping, it is actually not quite as good as version 2.2, understandably because it's only 4 times oversampling rather than 5. But now if we go to version 2.4, we can see that all the aliasing is pretty much below 120 decibels. So it's much closer to the 24-bit level, which is fantastic. And I did have some people asking me in the comments of previous videos if I could do comparisons to more plugins. Now, I don't necessarily want to do this. It seems a little bit biased coming from, another developer testing other people's plugins. That's not something that I want to be doing. But one that came up, rather than trying to compare Kazrog K-Clip 0, the free version, I've got a demo here of K-Clip 3. And if we compare this with a 0 dB knee, so we can see that the aliasing creeps up again when I decrease the knee, as expected. And if I solo K-Clip 3, we can see the aliasing here in this setup that I have. And if I compare that to Clipper 2.3, it's kind of close. It's they're both 4 times oversampling. So Clipper 2.3 is slightly better. If I go more, a lower threshold, so I'm doing more clipping, and then compare that to K-Clip 3, so they're pretty even. This may be slightly more with K-Clip 3. That is on 4 times oversampling. As soon as you go 8 times oversampling, then the anti-aliasing is better than GMaudio Clipper. But that's at the cost of CPU usage and latency. So we can see that on 4 times, that the latency down here is 38 samples. So going back to my previous videos saying what the best clipper is for Ableton Live, the reason why GMaudio Clipper I think is the best is because of this balance between latency, anti-aliasing, ease of use, and tight integration into Live. So we can see it is an improvement over other plugins on the market if compared at the same oversampling rate. And we can see that comparing previous versions, that Clipper 2.4 is better in most cases. So slightly less aliasing. If I bring that knee back up to 6 dB, then we get slightly less aliasing. Now you will see that there's a change here in the highest frequencies, and that is because the cutoff for the oversampling filter is now much higher. It's actually at the Nyquist frequency. And this allowed me to take advantage of some CPU optimizations where I could do basically less multiplications inside the filter. So I can make the filter a little bit longer at the cost of a little bit of latency, but then without too many more calculations because of those optimizations. So better anti-aliasing, slightly more latency, and a couple of extra features. Now, before we move on to how these ultrasonic utilities sound, I just want to show you the difference in filtering. We can see that in version 2.2, where it had the delta oversampling, that the filtering effectively disappears, but it does leave that remainder, which some people didn't like. In version 2.3, it's exactly the same, but in 2.4, we can see that there is some filtering apparent. It is still quite light, and it is comparable to other plugins on the market, such as K-Clip 3. So you can see that I've got a slightly softer filter. So it does filter out a little bit earlier, and that allows me to keep the latency lower. And most of the filtering is happening above 20 kilohertz, so it's beyond what we can hear anyway, and works quite well. But now in version 2.4, if I increase the FIR remainder, we can see that when it hits about minus 20 dB, that we start to see a difference here. So I'm just going to zoom in and focus on these high frequencies. So with none of that remainder, we can see that it dips to minus 6 dB at Nyquist. And then if I put this up, I can go all the way up, and it effectively removes that filter. So that's basically adding in the original signal that is unclipped to make the oversampling filter disappear. And that was basically what the delta oversampling was doing. So now you have this control to effectively control that and change whether or not you want filtering to be apparent. Now, if I turn on the ultrasonic low pass filter, which is a 5th order ladder filter, then we see that it is quite sharp. And if I zoom out again now, so you can see that the filtering really only starts to happen around 20 kilohertz. So it's roughly minus 3 dB at 20 kilohertz. A little bit more than that with the oversampling filter on. And then it'll just filter out. And then at Nyquist, it will be minus infinity dB. So this is a very steep filter. It's pretty efficient and yeah, sounds quite nice. But that effectively attenuates any aliasing that might remain in the highest frequencies that the oversampling filter doesn't quite filter out. So it works quite well. Both of these controls really should be done to taste, as we'll see in the next example. But I think the extra control is definitely worthwhile, and it just gives GMaudio Clipper an extra point of difference so that it goes well beyond your standard clippers that are on the market. So this stuff combined with the brick wall limiter, which has also been changed, it's now a little bit faster. I think I'm pretty happy with GMaudio Clipper 2.4 and probably won't need to make any updates for quite a while. All right, now let's move on to some audio examples. All right, so here I have a project from my Squeeze examples. It was a track that I started, a neurofunk style track called Rat King that was on SoundCloud as part of my examples for using Squeeze. And I think this is a pretty good example to test out some of the new features in GMaudio Clipper 2.4. Now this project has a clipper on nearly every track, plus on the groups for both the bass group and the percussion group, and then also on the group of those groups plus the master. So there are quite a few clippers in this project. With the previous version, CPU usage on my computer was around 35%. It is now closer to 40%. So not a huge difference in CPU, but better anti-aliasing and those new ultrasonic utilities. So let's have a listen to the percussion first. And I'm just going on the kick here. So yeah, I'm using the brick wall limiter here. Obviously, with things that don't have too much high frequencies, it's going to be hard to hear what's happening with these ultrasonic utilities. So if I turn that up, you probably really need to be wearing headphones to be able to hear the effects. It's more of a feeling rather than what you can actually hear. It's quite difficult to describe, but there's a bit more brightness, but with it lowered, it does sound a bit clearer. And then with the ultrasonic low pass filter, probably sounds a bit tighter, and I kind of like that on there. So I've got these hats. I do apologize. This project is very loud because there is Squeeze on just about everything as well. So it's really pushing Squeeze and Clipper to the limits. And without those two devices, this project wouldn't be possible. So things will be loud. Here we have some hats. Ultrasonic low pass filter isn't doing too much, nor is the FIR remainder, probably because it's happening very quickly and there's not too much clipping. Let's go on to the breakbeat. See, it almost sounds brighter with the ultrasonic low pass filter on. But a lot of the time with high frequencies, by actually taking some away, you make what's there, what remains, more apparent. So it actually sounds brighter. Sounds quite good with the FIR remainder in there as well. Kind of brings up more of that brightness. So with none, then with that in there, plus the ultrasonic low pass filter, I quite like. Then all together, So I've got both the FIR remainder and the ultrasonic low pass filter on this particular group. So if I turn these off, versus having them on. Not a huge difference because I've put them on elsewhere. So if I leave them off and then come back here and turn this stuff off, now if I come back to here, should make more of a difference on the group. So that changes the sound of the snare a bit. And that changes the brightness a little bit. With the two combined, sounds good. But it also sounds good with them off. So a lot of this really will just come down to preferences and will have to be tuned per project. It might be that it sounds a little bit better on the instruments themselves, or it might sound a little bit better used on the groups. So I'm going to do the low pass filter on the snare. Nothing on the hats. Ultrasonic low pass filter on the brake. Then the FIR remainder on the group. And I think I like that. So now let's have a look at the bass. So obviously, being bass, it doesn't necessarily need those high frequencies, so I think it sounds a bit clearer and tighter with that ultrasonic low pass filter on. Because a lot of these sounds have been clipped quite heavily, so it does make sense to have that on and remove any frequency content that might be close to Nyquist. Yeah, and on all of these I'm using the limiter, but not the FIR remainder or ultrasonic low pass filter. So I could try with it on. These sounds kind of come in and out, so it's hard to hear a difference, but I don't mind it with the ultrasonic low pass filter on. And then I might not need it on the group. Now we should be listening to things while they're playing all together. So I think with the filter on all of these, but then using the FIR remainder on the group, it sounds better to my ears. In this mix at least, it'll be different each time. Just going to turn those basses up a bit. Now I've got another clipper on the whole group, and I've got the FIR remainder up, which I do like the sound of. So the FIR remainder definitely does work nicely on groups or wherever you're doing a smaller amount of processing. So groups of tracks or groups of groups or the master, the FIR remainder might be nice. On individual instruments, the ultrasonic low pass filter might be nice. So you really just have to try them out. So I've also got one on the master as well. And the FIR remainder really doesn't make much difference here. And the ultrasonic low pass filter kind of muffles the sound slightly. So perhaps I'll just use a little bit of the FIR remainder on the master. So now I've got perfect control over the highest frequencies in this particular project. I'm using lots of clipping, lots of limiting, and then those extra utilities just allows me to dial in what's happening in the super top end, which is really what gets most affected when you are adding a lot of extra harmonics with clipping. So I hope you enjoy the new features. If you have any questions, do leave them in the comments. The user manual has been updated, and by the time this video is posted, you'll have access to the latest version. Thanks for watching, everyone. See you next time.